Thank you for returning so promptly to lunch. I'm always aware that I'm a Massachusetts citizen, but when looking at as all of you were registering for this conference, I became acutely aware of it since the towns included our South Hadley, Charleston, Brookline, Chestnut Hill, Shrewsbury, Bridgewater, Newbury, North Chelmsford, Newton, Arlington, Needham, Bridgewater, Salem, Roxbury, Marshfield, East Freetown, Haverhill, Swampscott, Framingham, Stowe, Boston, Cambridge, a lot of Cambridge, and Somerville, as well as some of you from as far away as Atlanta, Georgia, and Syracuse, New York. But I feel that we in Massachusetts are really blessed with the representation we have in both houses of Congress. Particularly on the issue of war and peace. A few moments later in the afternoon, Congressman Jim McGovern, the first co-sponsor in the House of the Markey-Lieu bill, is here to participate in an upcoming panel. And right now, Senator Ed Markey himself is here to encourage the work of this gathering. Senator Markey is the leading voice in the U.S. Senate for reining in the nuclear threat and for the reassertion of Congress's constitutional authority over war. He has served in Congress since 1976, representing Massachusetts' 5th District from 1976 to 2013, and now in the Senate, where he has introduced vital legislation, including restricting first use of Nuclear Weapons Act of 2017, the Markey-Lieu bill, and no unconstitutional attack against North Korea Act of 2017, the Markey-Conyers bill, and many other pieces of work against nuclear weapons, such as his letter to President Obama in the summer of 2016, asking that the long-range standoff missile be canceled, and a number of other things, including asking President Obama to eliminate the policy of first use. Senator Markey is a strong spokesman for sanity in nuclear issues, for the constitutional responsibility of Congress, and especially for the importance of the general public in informing the decisions of government. Please join me in welcoming Senator Ed Markey.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you for organizing such a fantastic, timely conference here today. And thank you to Cole and to Jonathan for all of their work in making sure that we have all of the people who we would want to have in this room as we really begin to ratchet up this debate about the first use of nuclear weapons. This issue, Mark Twain used to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. So this does rhyme a lot with what Ronald Reagan did as soon as he came in. He broke off all negotiations with the Soviet Union on nuclear weapons that had been going on since the Eisenhower era, that kept the dialogue open, that kept this situation in a posture where our two countries were talking. But when he broke off all negotiations, something happened. And it began here in Massachusetts. And it was something that became known as the nuclear freeze movement. It was grassroots, ordinary people who began to rise up and say, the problem with the nuclear arms race is the nuclear arms race. That is the problem. And what SALT I and SALT II were doing was just measuring how many new weapons on either side could be built, not whether or not we were going to freeze and then reduce. So it took the public to change the way that the whole debate was conducted in the United States. So I wrote a book in 1982, Nuclear Peril, The Politics of Proliferation. You can get it for $2 on eBay or Amazon if you want, with a foreword by Senator Edward M. Kennedy and squibs from Mary McGrory and George Ball and Bishop James Armstrong, president of the National Council of churches, and Ted Taylor, the man who figured out how to miniaturize nuclear weapons. All of them saying pretty much the same thing, that we had to end the arms race. And what I said here is that if we don't stop, how are we going to tell, which is what this book is about, India and Pakistan and Iran and Iraq and North Korea that they should not have nuclear weapons? You cannot preach temperance from a bar stool. You have no moral credibility whatsoever. So these issues don't go away, although this guy who wrote this book, he's gone away. The 1.0 Ed Markey, who I really miss, is gone. But the issues remain the same. And so I introduced the nuclear freeze resolution in the House with Silvio Conti in February of 1982, and Ted Kennedy introduced it with Mark Hatfield in February of 1982. And then I just started to gather co-signatories. Just this kind of crazy grassroots movement. By June, we had 1 million people in Central Park, the largest single demonstration still to this day that has ever been gathered around any issue in American history. That happened in the blink of an eye. It came out of the grassroots. It's what you today represent in terms of the power of this issue. We need to go back and say, how do we not agonize, but how do we organize around the issue of the use of nuclear weapons in our country, especially since there is $1 trillion worth of new nuclear weapons on the blueprints of the Pentagon that the Armed Services Committees in both houses are like rubber stamping. It sends a message to the world that the United States is still under the misimpression that these weapons are usable, that nuclear wars are fightable. So we thank you for everything that you are doing just by being here today. And that nuclear freeze resolution ultimately passed on May 4th, 1983 in the House of Representatives by a 278 to 149 final vote, over 53 hours of debate with Tip O'Neill, who I asked to be the final speaker, saying this was one of the great debates in the history of the House of Representatives. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we must have again at this point in time. We have to elevate this issue in a way that ensures that the American people understand what the consequences are of not paying attention to President Trump and what is going on in the Korean Peninsula right now. So it's my great honor to be here with my great friend and partner, Jim McGovern. If you Google the word peace, Jim McGovern's picture comes up, okay? This man is just absolutely unbelievable, committed every day, insistently, persistently, consistently, to raise the issues of peace in the United States House of Representatives. So we thank you, Jim, for everything that you do on a daily basis. And I also want to acknowledge the leading light in the cause of reducing the dangers of nuclear weapons, my longtime friend and mentor on these issues, and former Secretary of Defense, the great Bill Perry, who is here with us. So thank you, Bill, for everything that you do and are continuing to do. This event is focused on an issue that has been important to me for all 41 years that I have served in Congress, and that is whether any American president has the right to use a nuclear weapon first in peacetime. But we have reached a critical point, one that is far more urgent than ever before. Despite the almost incomprehensible power of these humanity-crushing weapons, successive American presidents have interpreted existing law to give them unconditional and unilateral authority to launch a nuclear first strike, even when the country targeted is not carrying out a nuclear attack against us. The panels which you've had have been brilliant. The discussion which we're having here is absolutely essential, and we must now take this discussion and move it out into the commons of this country. We need people to be rising up and rallying around all of this fantastic information which has been presented here, because what is being contemplated is unconstitutional, it is undemocratic, and it is simply unconscionable, which in normal times is bad enough. But we all know we are not living in normal times. Okay? We have a president who actually talks about this issue of fire and fury being being dropped upon the North Korean people. And people say, well, it could all just be bluster. And that's true. It could have been bluster that he was going to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but it wasn't. It could have been just a positioning game that he was playing before he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but it wasn't. It might have just been a way to try to renegotiate the Iran nuclear agreement before he decertified it, but it wasn't. It might have just been a play before he named Scott Pruitt as the head of the EPA, but in fact, the effort there is to turn EPA into every polluter's ally. On every other promise that he's made, he's been good on his promises. And so we should take him at his word here and not assume that it's just bluster. Assume that since there are no exceptions thus far, although there was a brief moment when on DACA, he was saying that he would support allowing these dreamers to come into the country, but his base very quickly disciplined him, and he backed away extremely rapidly from honoring that commitment. So we have a great responsibility. We have to ensure that this man who is the president understands that there is a massive counterinsurgency which is now building across our country because unilateral first use by the president would directly contravene the intent of our founding fathers. They specifically designed the Constitution so that no one individual would ever have such unconstrained power. Instead, they gave Congress the sole and exclusive power to declare war and commit U.S. forces to offensive military actions absent very specific circumstances. And in many ways, the Congress has abdicated this responsibility. But we cannot abdicate this responsibility when it comes to a single human being deciding to launch and begin a nuclear war without coming to the elected representatives of the people of our country. That is the debate which we now must have in our country, because it is vital that the president have the clear authority to respond to nuclear attacks on the United States, our forces, or our allies. But that does not mean that any U.S. president should have the power to launch a first-use nuclear strike without congressional approval. Some theorists will say that restricting so-called first use weakens American deterrence. But that simply is not the case. The United States has the world's most powerful conventional arsenal and the most powerful nuclear response capability. We do not need to threaten a nuclear first strike to deter others from launching attacks. In fact, there are dangerous downsides to maintaining a first-use posture. If adversaries believe that we may go nuclear, we create the very pressure that encourages them to build nuclear arsenals and keep them on high alert. The risk of inadvertent nuclear war has risen to a level that is simply unacceptable. And that is why I have introduced, along with my colleague, Representative Ted Lieu of California, and Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, legislation that makes crystal clear that Congress must check the president's authority. Critics of this bill will try to argue that it will limit the president's powers to defend the American people and our allies around the world. It will not. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, the president may repel sudden attacks as soon as our military and intelligence agencies inform him of such an attack. Unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of relegating this issue to theoretical debates. This week, Secretaries of State and Defense appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In that hearing, I asked Secretary Mattis if he could contemplate the president ordering a nuclear first strike in the absence of a nuclear attack on us. He responded that such an attack would be possible in the case of an imminent attack. But then the next question is, whose definition of imminent is going to be used? If it is Donald Trump's, as we have heard on the earlier panel, and there's homogeneity that engulfs his advisors, then this definition of imminent ultimately becomes something that winds up with his closest advisors deferring to the president himself as he determines. And that is why we need a national debate on this issue, because the ambiguity on its own is cause for great concern. And the debate is taking place in the midst of a war of words with North Korea that could very well turn into an actual war, which is why I asked Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to have a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on first use of nuclear weapons in the United States, and we are going to have that hearing in 10 days in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It should be the beginning here of this incredible decision, which may be looming in the White House. North Korea is destabilizing the region. We're not going to debate that. Kim Jong-un is threatening the United States and its allies through its accelerated nuclear and ballistic missile programs and is assassinating rivals with impunity. But threats to totally destroy North Korea by our government risk spreading destruction. The president, through his reckless and dangerous rhetoric, has given credence to North Korea's feeble argument that its pursuit of nuclear-armed ballistic missiles are necessary for their self-defense. And it has unnecessarily increased the risk of devastating war. This is why I have introduced additional legislation, this time with Congressman John Conyers of Michigan and again Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, that would prevent the Department of Defense and other federal agencies from spending any money to carry out an attack, conventional or nuclear, on North Korea without congressional approval. We cannot abdicate our responsibility. Secretary Mattis called a second Korean War catastrophic. That, I am here to tell you, is an understatement. An American attack on North Korea would trigger a counterattack that would rain artillery and possibly worse on Seoul, a bustling city of 25 million people. And without justification that had been established through the UN or through our alliances, the United States would be on its own, unlike the first Korean War, where 21 countries under the United Nations banner defended South Korea from a North Korean invasion. Contrary to popular belief, a war that starts with a U.S. first strike on North Korea, it would not just be fought over there. The consequences would be more significant and would hit much closer to home than many realize. Number one, a strike would not destroy all of the nuclear weapons in North Korea. That is, that if there was a tailored use of low-yield nuclear weapons, that there's no guarantee that they would completely destroy the entire North Korean nuclear arsenal. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because the Pentagon, answering Congressman Lieu, sent a letter back to him last week. Here's what the answer from the Pentagon said. It said, the only way to locate and destroy with complete certainty all components of North Korea's nuclear weapons program would be through a ground invasion. That's the Pentagon, last week of October 2017. The weapons would be deeply buried, scattered throughout the country, and our soldiers would have to fight their way across the country under threat of chemical and biological attack. Number two, we would face China on the battlefield. China does not want to fight the United States. But if we start a second Korean War, Beijing would have to fight. They don't want us on their border. In 1950, China fought with only a fraction of the military capability, confidence, and regional ambition it has now. Worse, according to, again, an October 2017 RAND Corporation study, even an initially localized conflict with China could quickly spread into the economic, cyber, and space realms, doing considerable damage to both sides. America, once again, would be flung into a full-fledged military campaign. Conflict between the world's two biggest economies risks the specter of a global economic meltdown. And three, the post-conflict reconstruction would be costly and very difficult. A post-conflict North Korea would make the occupation of Iraq look easy. There is no country on the planet more isolated than North Korea. No state is less prepared to reintegrate into the modern world. We could well face a North Korean insurgency fueled by a population brainwashed to believe that America is its mortal enemy. Once again, Americans would not be viewed as liberators. General McMaster said that we, quote, are running out of time with North Korea. But I want to speak very plainly here. We must not rush to war. We must not make the calamitous error of sparking widespread war with a first strike, nuclear or otherwise. That is the challenge our country is facing right now. In these times, it is imperative that the United States reassert itself as a world leader by using all of the tools at its disposal, not just the threats of military force. There is far too much at stake. To protect ourselves, our allies, and humanity itself, we must continue to tighten pressure on North Korea, coupled with robust diplomatic efforts. We must be builders and not destroyers. Instead of unleashing fire and fury, we must construct stronger international sanctions that, one, cut off the flow of oil from China into North Korea. Two, stop the Kim regime from selling the slave labor of its people. Three, eliminate Pyongyang's illicit drug trade. Four, halt its procurement of key rocket fuel chemicals. And five, end its use of the internet and cryptocurrencies to commit cybercrime and evade sanctions. But pressure alone is counterproductive. When Donald Trump applies pressure while publicly dismissing the possibility of a diplomatic solution, he makes war more likely. A successful diplomatic strategy must combine the pressure of even tougher sanctions, especially the cutting off of oil, with talks that convince Kim Jong-un that we do not seek to decapitate his regime. If Kim believes that the goal of our pressure is to overthrow his regime, as was the case with Saddam or Gaddafi, we would inadvertently encourage him to use his military capabilities in a last-ditch effort to save himself. We must assure our allies and our partners of this as well. Beijing, for example, fears a flood of refugees into China in the event of a North Korean collapse. But in 2006, China cut off the oil to North Korea, and within a few weeks, North Korea came back to the six-party talks. That can work again. And we must continue to work with our allies, South Korea and Japan, to strengthen our collective ability to deter and defend against North Korean attack. This multifaceted approach of pressure, diplomacy, and defense is the only way to avoid disaster. The current trajectory will only lead to an ever more threatening North Korea or an increased chance of a U.S. first strike. So, we come back to this hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 10 days, where witnesses representing each perspective will begin to speak to each of the senators about the options which are available and what could trigger a use of nuclear weapons. What is the definition of imminent? What should it mean? How should senators and members of the public understand the definition of imminent? We need this debate in our country, and the more that we have the debate is the more concerned people are going to be across the country, because they do not want, in my opinion, to reserve the definition of imminent to Donald Trump. Okay? They want this definition to be well understood, because it is their children, it is their young people who will be ultimately at risk if the wrong decision is made. So this could not be more timely. Bill Perry recently wrote, quote, "It is distressingly easy to imagine scenarios in which miscalculations lead to catastrophic consequences involving casualties that could climb into the millions." Congress is a stimulus response institution. There's nothing more stimulating than millions of people emailing and faxing and Facebooking and calling into the United States Congress. That is how you get change. That is how you get people interested in an issue. And so that's going to be our challenge. And everyone will say to you, well, you are not an expert. The people don't know. But just understand this, congressional expert is an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp or Salt Lake City nightlife. I mean, there is no such thing. The experts are the same experts that in 1982 rose up with the nuclear freeze movement. They are the people who stood up and say, we have a right to ask you questions, Mr. Expert. You have a responsibility to answer to us how these weapons are going to be used. So this is the time, this is the place, and once again, it comes to Massachusetts. It comes to the people who are in this room. We have to begin to organize intensively to make sure that we have co-sponsors on our legislation, but that all across the country, in town after town, that these petitions begin to be gathered, that politicians understand that this issue must be debated, that the consequences could be catastrophic. The president doesn't even intend, it looks like, in exhausting all of the economic sanctions which could be imposed upon the North Koreans, coupled with diplomacy. We have to pressure them in order to accomplish that goal. So you are, once again, the historic figures. It comes to us, Massachusetts, to begin this effort. And it can spread just as fast as it did in 1982. It was the blink of a political eye, and it was a shock to Washington, to the SALT I and SALT II experts, that the public had come to this very simple, common sense conclusion about the nuclear arms race. This is the time I ask all of you to do everything you can in order to support legislation which blocks the use of nuclear weapons first by the United States when we have not been attacked. Thank you all so much for everything that you're doing.